permanent and sustainable ceasefire. At the same time, the draft resolution demands the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages and emphasizes that humanitarian access must be allowed to address their medical and other humanitarian needs. These have been among our key demands for weeks. The draft resolution further demands that the parties comply with their obligations under international law, as we said before, including international humanitarian law and human rights law. The draft resolution also emphasizes the need for the parties to abide by the pertinent resolutions adopted by this Council, including resolutions 2712 and 2720 of 2023. The E10 have adopted a consultative approach during the negotiation process of this text. We have consulted extensively and in good faith with all members of this Council in a frank, open, and flexible manner with the aim of achieving a text that addresses the situation in Gaza. The adoption of this draft resolution will certainly be another important step this Council can build upon to comprehensively address the crisis in Gaza. Given the utmost urgency of the situation, we call upon all members of this Council, all and each member of this Council, to vote in favor of this resolution. While this resolution is crucial, it is essential that we continue working towards a comprehensive ceasefire and a lasting peace in the region. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Mozambique for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Russian Federation.
Господин председатель,
Mr. President,
мы весьма разочарованы и
we are
озадачены,
extremely stunned
как
and
велась работа
disappointed
над
about the
проектом
way the
резолюции
work
в
on
последние
the draft
24
resolution in the
часа.
last 24 hours was done.
О том, что слово permanent
The fact that the
в
word
оперативном
permanent
параграфе
in
1
OP1
применительно к прекращению огня предлагается
relation to
заменить
a
на более
ceasefire is
слабую
proposed to be
формулировку.
replaced by a more weak wording.
Мы узнали чуть более чем
Was
за час до
something
начала
we
заседания.
learned about a little more than an hour before the beginning of the meeting.
Это недопустимо.
That is unacceptable.
Мы все получали
We all
инструкции
received
на голосование
instructions
по
for the
тексту, в
vote
котором
on
было
the
слово
text
permanent,
that contained the
и
word
считаем это
permanent,
принципиально
and we
важным.
believe that that is of fundamental
Все
importance.
остальные формулировки
All of the
оставляют
remaining
слишком большое
wording
поле для интерпретации,
leaves too broad an area for interpretation,
что может позволить
which
Израилю
could allow
возобновить
Israel
военную
to
операцию в
resume its
секторе
military
Газа
operation in the
в
Gaza
любой
Strip
момент
at any
после
moment
истечения
following the
прекращения огня,
expiry of the ceasefire,
которое, надеемся, сегодня
which
будет
we
установлено.
today hope will be established.
С тем, чтобы избежать такого
In order
сценария, мы
to
хотим
avoid
внести
this
в текст
scenario, we
устную
would like to
поправку и
make an
вернуть
oral
слово
amendment to the
permanent
text and
в
return the word
оперативный параграф 1.
permanent in
Таким
OP1.
образом, он
In
будет
so
звучать
doing,
так,
it
как
would
это
read
звучало
as it read
прежде изданной резолюции,
in
а
the
именно
previously issued resolution, namely,
demands an immediate ceasefire for the month of Ramadan, respected by all parties, leading to a permanent sustainable ceasefire, and also demands the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages, as well as ensuring humanitarian access to address their medical and other humanitarian needs, and further demands that the parties comply with their obligations under international law in relation to all persons they detain. Благодарю вас.
thank you.
I thank the representative of Russian Federation for their statement. Members of the Council have before them a proposed amendment submitted by Russian Federation to the text of the draft resolution contained in the document S/2024/254 submitted by Algeria, Ecuador, Guyana, Japan, Malta, Mozambique, Republic of Korea, Sierra Leone, Slovenia, and Switzerland. Rule 36 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure states, inter alia, the following. When an amendment adds to or deletes from the text of a motion or draft resolution, that amendment shall be voted on first. Accordingly, I intend to put the proposed amendment to the vote first. Will those in favor of proposed amendment please raise their hand? Against? Abstentions? The result of the voting is as follows. 3 votes in favor, 1 vote against, 11 abstentions. The proposed amendment has not been adopted, having failed to obtain the required number of votes. I shall put the draft resolution to the vote now. Will those in favor of the draft resolution contained in document S/2024/254 please raise their hand? Those against? Abstention? The result of the voting is as follows. 14 votes in favor, 0 vote against, 1 abstention. The draft resolution has been adopted as Resolution 2728, 2024. I now give the floor to those members of the Council who wish to make statements after the vote. I give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
شكرا سيد الرئيس.
Thank you, Mr. President.
أود أن أشكر جميع
I would
أعضاء
like to thank
المجلس
all
على
the
المرونة
council members for their
والعمل
flexibility
البناء
and the constructive way
الذي مكننا اليوم
that allowed us today
من اعتماد قرار
to adopt
طال انتظاره.
this long-awaited resolution.
قرار يطلب وقف إطلاق
A
النار بغزة
resolution that calls
فوراً
for an immediate
من
ceasefire
أجل
in the Gaza Strip
وضع حد
in order
للمجازر
to put an end to
التي
the
لا تزال
massacres
للأسف
that
مستمرة منذ
unfortunately
من
are still
5
ongoing
أشهر.
over the
5
past
أشهر.
5 months.
ذاق خلالها الشعب الفلسطيني كل
Over
أشكال
the past
العذاب
5 months,
كل أشكال
the Palestinian
المعاناة.
people has suffered
لقد
greatly.
استمر حمام الدم طويلا
This bloodbath
وبأشكال
has
بشعة
continued for far too long.
وأصبح من الواجب وضع حد له
It is our
قبل فوات
obligation to put an
الأوان.
end to this bloodbath before it
أخيراً
is too late.
أخيرا
Finally,
يرتقي مجلس الأمن لحجم
the
المسؤوليات
Security
التي
Council
تقع عليه
is shouldering its responsibility
باعتباره المسؤول الأول
as the
عن حفظ السلم
primary organ
والأمن
responsible
الدوليين
for maintaining international peace
ويستجب
and security.
لمطالب
It is finally
الشعوب
responding to the
والمجموعة
calls
الدولية
of the
كما
international
نادي
community.
بها مرارا وتكرارا
These repeated
السيد
calls,
الأمين العام أنطونيو غوتيريش
not only from the international
الذي
community, but also from the Secretary General,
نجدد
Mr.
له
Antonio Guterres.
الدعم
And once again, we
على
renew
موقفه
our
النبيل
support to the Secretary General for his noble position
ومناصرته
and for his
للحق.
support to this just cause.
وهذا رغم الحملات المغرضة
Despite the heinous
التي
campaigns
يتعرض لها
that were launched
سيد
against him.
الرئيس
Mr. President,
عند التصويت على مشروع قرار التي
when
تقدمت
we
به
voted
الجزائر الشهر
on
الماضي
the draft resolution tabled by
وعدنا.
Algeria last month,
وعدنا
we
بأننا
promised
لن نكل
that
ولن
we
نمل
will spare no
حتى
effort.
يتحمل مجلس الأمن
We will continue
مسؤولياته
to work
كاملة
hard to make sure that the Security
غير
Council
منقوصة
is abiding by its full responsibility.
ووعدنا بأننا
We also promised
سنعود
that we will
لنقرع
come back
مجددا
once again
أبواب مجلس الأمن.
to knock on the doors
وها.
of the Security Council.
قد عدنا اليوم
And here we are
مع
today,
جميع الدول المنتخبة بالمجلس
all 10
في رسالة
elected
واضحة
member states,
للشعب الفلسطيني
to convey a clear message to the Palestinian people.
مفادها أن
This
المجموعة
message is
الدولية
as follows.
بمختلف
The international community
أطيافها
in its entirety
تشعر تشعر ولم تتخلى عنكم
did not abandon you,
تشعر بآلامكم
feels your
ولم
suffering.
تتخلى عنكم سيد الرئيس
It did not abandon you. Mr.
إن
President,
اعتماد قرار اليوم
adopting today's
ما
resolution
هو إلا بداية
is only the beginning
نحو تحقيق آمال الشعب الفلسطيني
to meet the aspirations of the Palestinian people.
ونتطلع بالتزام المحتل الإسرائيلي
We look forward
بهذا
to the
القرار
commitment and the
وأن
compliance of the Israeli
يتوقف
occupying
القتل
power with
فورا
this resolution
ومن
them
دون
to put
شروط
an end to the
وترفع
bloodbath without any
المعاناة
conditions,
عن الشعب
to
الفلسطيني
end the suffering of the
ومجلس الأمن
Palestinian people.
من واجبه
It is the
أن يسهر
responsibility
على
of the
ضمان
Security Council
تنفيذ
to
أحكام
ensure
هذا
the
القرار
implementation of the provisions of
في
this
الأخير
resolution.
سيد الرئيس أؤكد
In conclusion, Mr.
أن
President,
الجزائر ستعود
I reaffirm that
قريبا
Algeria
لتخاطب مجلس الأمن
will
مرة أخرى
return once again before the
ظل
Security Council
توجيهات رئيس الجمهورية السيد عبد المجيد تبون
under the instructions of
حتى
His
تكون
Excellency the
دولة
President of the
فلسطين
Republic
في
to
مكانها
make sure
الطبيعي
that Palestine returns
عضوا
to its
كاملاً.
natural
عضوا
status
كاملا
as a full-fledged
وسيداً
member,
بالأمم
a
المتحدة
sovereign
وشكراً.
member states of the United Nations. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Algeria for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the top, I want to express my deepest condolences to the families and loved ones of last week's terrorist attack in Moscow. We condemn terrorism in all its forms and stand in solidarity with the Russian people in grieving the loss of life from this horrific event. Colleagues, today this council spoke out in support of the ongoing diplomatic efforts led by the United States, Qatar, Egypt, to bring about an immediate and sustainable ceasefire, secure the immediate release of all hostages, and help alleviate the tremendous suffering of Palestinian civilians in Gaza who are in dire need of protection and life-saving humanitarian assistance. The United States fully supports these critical objectives. In fact, they were the foundation of the resolution we put forward last week, a resolution that Russia and China vetoed. But colleagues, the United States' support for these objectives is not simply rhetorical. We're working around the clock to make them real on the ground through diplomacy, because we know that it is only through diplomacy that we can push this agenda forward. We're getting closer to a deal for an immediate ceasefire with the release of all hostages, but we're not there yet. Now let's be clear. A ceasefire could have come about months ago if Hamas had been willing to release hostages, months ago. Instead, Hamas continues to stand in the way of peace, to throw up roadblocks, cower in tunnels beneath Gaza cities and behind under civilian infrastructure and hide among the civilian population. So today, my ask to members of this council and to member states in every region of the world is this: speak out and demand unequivocally that Hamas accepts the deal on the table. Now, I hope I'm wrong, I really do, but I don't expect that from Russia and China, especially because they still can't bring themselves to condemn Hamas's terrorist attacks on October 7th. Just last week, Russia and China vetoed a resolution that condemned this horrific attack, a resolution the vast majority of this council supported. They have shown time and time again that they are not actually interested in advancing a durable peace through diplomatic efforts, nor for all their rhetoric are they interested in making any meaningful contributions to humanitarian efforts. Instead, they are using this devastating conflict as a political cudgel to try to divide this council at a time when we need to come together. It is deeply, deeply cynical, and we should all see through it. Colleagues, we appreciated the willingness of members of this council to take some of our edits and improve on this resolution. Still, certain key edits were ignored, including our request to add a condemnation of Hamas. And we did not agree with everything in the resolution. For that reason, we were unfortunately not able to vote yes. However, as I've said before, we fully support some of the critical objectives in this non-binding resolution. And we believe it was important for the council to speak out and make clear that our ceasefire any ceasefire must come with the release of all hostages. Indeed, as I've said before, the only path to a durable end to this conflict is the release of all hostages. Critically, a ceasefire and the release of hostages will allow much more humanitarian aid to get into Gaza at a time when famine is looming large, and provide an opportunity to work toward a sustainable cessation of hostilities, toward a future where Hamas can no longer threaten Israel and never repeat October 7th, and no longer control Gaza and use civilians as shields, toward a future where Palestinians and Israelis live side by side in peace in two democratic states of their own. Something that will never happen with Hamas, a terrorist organization dedicated to the destruction of Israel and the killing of Jews, a terrorist organization this body still fails to condemn, controlling Gaza. Colleagues, we meet during the holy month of Ramadan. This should be a season of peace for Muslim communities around the world. Just as October 7th, Simchat Torah, should have been a day of peace for Jewish communities. This resolution rightly acknowledges that during the month of Ramadan, we must recommit to peace. Hamas can do that by accepting the deal on the table. A ceasefire can begin immediately with the release of the first hostage. And so we must put pressure on Hamas to do just that. This is the only path to securing a ceasefire and the release of hostages, as we have all called for today. That is what this resolution means. A ceasefire of any duration must come with the release of hostages. This is the only path. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Slovenia.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Today is an important day. Most of all, we hope it will signal an important day for the people of the Middle East, a day that will help silence the guns, stop the killing, free the hostages, as well as bring some calm to and clear the sky over Gaza. The day that marks the beginning of the end of pain and suffering of civilians. This is a significant day for the elected members. We found our voice of an unifying force inside the Council. This is the reason why we are on the Council. We showed the leadership for peace. And it is a good day for the whole Council, as we aligned our efforts and decision with the calls coming from the UN General Assembly and the UN Secretary General, from the humanitarian organizations, and from the world public. We demonstrated that we can find unity for peace, a small step in rebuilding trust in the Council. Today's resolution is just the beginning. We will need more of this unity for Gaza, as well as for many other conflicts, and Slovenia is ready. Mr. President, I don't need, but I wish to thank my colleagues, the elected members, as we went through the process together. This is Slovenia's third month on the Council, and we are looking forward to many more joint ventures together in search of peace. I wanted to thank the permanent members for giving us a chance, for having trust in the power of the EU10, and for being patient during negotiations. Mr. President, we delivered the strongest signal thus far. We demand an immediate ceasefire for the month of Ramadan, leading to lasting, sustainable ceasefire. It is a call we have all been desperate to hear from the Council. A short and focused resolution is a firm sign from the Council that this conflict must stop. It offers an opportunity for peace for Palestinians and an opportunity for diplomatic efforts, including those of Egypt, Qatar, and the US, to continue. We express our appreciation for the commitment of the Secretary General, UN staff members on the ground, humanitarian coordinators, as well as for the leadership of different UN agencies, humanitarian and health organizations, including UNRWA. We recall the binding nature of the Security Council resolutions and call for swift implementation of this clear resolution, in particular with regards to the ceasefire, the unconditional release of hostages, and the urgent need for expansion of the flow of humanitarian aid. We also reiterate our call for full respect of international law, including international humanitarian law and human rights law. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Slovenia for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President. Today's adoption of the resolution proposed by the E10, including the Republic of Korea, has a historic meaning in that it is the very first resolution by this Council that demands a ceasefire in Gaza. After numerous attempts by the Council and consistent appeals by the UN Secretary General, OCHA, and so on, amid rising death tolls. It is also significant that this is the first ever resolution introduced by the E10 and adopted on a Security Council regional agenda item. As one of the E10, the Republic of Korea is pleased by today's adoption of the resolution and commends the dedicated efforts of all E10 colleagues, including Mozambique, E10 coordinator, Algeria, representing the views of the Arab world, and Japan, the presidency of the Council, in the process of drafting and negotiating the resolution. In addition, we appreciate the cooperation of the P5, in particular the US, for its sincere and utmost coordination with the E10 in the spirit of compromise. In order for today's resolution to have concrete significance beyond the internal politics of the Security Council, it must have a tangible impact on the situation in the Gaza Strip by saving the lives of innocent civilians and easing the humanitarian crisis. The situation on the ground in Gaza must be different before and after this resolution. This will only be possible when both Israel and Hamas respect and faithfully implement this resolution. Even though it is not explicitly coercive under Chapter 7 of the Charter, the parties to the conflict must bear in mind that this resolution reflects the consensus of the international community, one forged through active discussion in the Security Council and General Assembly for more than 5 months. The most important thing is implementing the ceasefire starting right now. As defined in the resolution, violence and firing must be ceased immediately. Hostages taken by Hamas and other groups must be returned to their families right away. Barriers to the provision of humanitarian assistance must be lifted. The entire international community must also actively cooperate to save civilian lives and overcome acute food insecurity through humanitarian aid at scale. Restore basic public order and improve Gaza's fundamental public services, including health and sanitation. And based on these achievements, preparations for redoubled political and diplomatic dialogue to resolve the Palestinian question in the long term must commence step by step. All parties will have to take a step back and respond to the global call to participate in the cause of restoring peace and humanity. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Republic of Korea for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Malta.
Thank you, President. At the offset, I wish to express our condolences to the Russian Federation for the atrocious terrorist attack of last week. We condemn all terrorism in all its form. Malta was proud to co-pen this resolution, which we have just adopted, which calls for a ceasefire for the month of Ramadan, leading to a lasting, sustainable ceasefire. With this resolution, the Security Council has clearly spoken out on the urgent and pressing need to stop the fighting. This is critical to alleviate the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza. This resolution must now be immediately and unconditionally implemented by all parties. The fighting needs to stop without further delays. All hostages must be safely released. On this occasion, we also express our appreciation and support for the ongoing negotiations by Egypt, Qatar, and the United States. We sincerely hope that these diplomatic efforts can lead to tangible results in the coming days. Meanwhile, humanitarian access to the Gaza Strip is of critical importance to avert the risk of famine. There is the urgent need to expand the flow of humanitarian assistance and in demanding the lifting of all barriers preventing the necessary humanitarian assistance as requested by this resolution. In closing, President, a sustainable ceasefire must also be accompanied by a political urgency to build a durable foundation for peace. Malta reaffirms its commitment to a just and comprehensive resolution of the conflict based on a two-state solution along the pre-1967 borders, addressing the legitimate aspirations of both sides, with Jerusalem as the future capital of two states, Israel and Palestine, living side by side in peace and security, in line with the relevant Security Council resolutions and internationally agreed parameters. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of France.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President,
la France se
France
félicite de l'adoption
welcomes
de la
the
résolution
adoption of
27-28.
Resolution
Plus de 5
2728.
mois
More than
après le
5
début de la
months
crise à
after the
Gaza,
beginning of the crisis in
provoquée par
Gaza,
l'attaque
caused
terroriste
by
du
the
Hamas,
terrorist attack
il
waged
était
by
temps que le
Hamas,
Conseil de
it was
sécurité
high
puisse
time for the
enfin
Security
agir.
Council to
Il était
act.
temps qu'il
It was
établisse
high
un
time for it to
cessez-le-feu.
establish a
Il était temps
ceasefire.
qu'il
It
exige
was
la
high time
libération
for
des
it to
otages.
demand the
Il
release of
était temps qu'il
hostages. It was
réclame
high
un
time for
accès
it to
humanitaire
call
complet
for
et une aide
comprehensive
massive
humanitarian access
alors
and
que la
mass
famine
aid at a
sévit
time when
à Gaza.
famine is rife in Gaza.
L'adoption de cette
The
résolution
adoption of this
montre que le
resolution
Conseil de sécurité
demonstrates
peut
that the
encore
Security
agir
Council can still
quand
act
tous ses membres
when all
font
of
les
its
efforts
members
nécessaires
make the
pour qu'il
necessary
puisse
effort
remplir son mandat.
to discharge
Je
their
tiens à cet
mandate. I
égard
wish in this
à saluer
connection to
personnellement le
personally
rôle de la représentante
commend
permanente des
the
États-Unis.
permanent representative of the United
Le
States for
silence
the role
du Conseil
played.
de
The Security
sécurité
Council's
sur Gaza
silence on
devenait
Gaza
assourdissant.
was becoming
Il
deafening.
est temps qu'il puisse
It
enfin
is high time
contribuer
now for
à
the
une
Council
sortie de
to
crise.
finally contribute to finding a
Celle-ci
solution
n'est
to
pas
this
terminée,
crisis.
hélas,
This crisis is not
et notre
over,
Conseil va
alas,
devoir
and our
rester
Council will have
mobilisé
to
et
remain mobilized
immédiatement
and
se remettre à la tâche.
immediately get
Il
back
va
to work.
devoir,
It will
après le
have to,
Ramadan,
following
qui se
Ramadan,
termine dans 2
which
semaines,
finishes in 2 weeks,
établir un
it will have
cessez-le-feu
to
permanent.
establish a permanent
Il lui faudra
ceasefire.
œuvrer
It will
au
need to
relèvement
strive
et à la
to
stabilisation
see
de
the
Gaza.
recovery and
Enfin
stabilization
et
of
surtout,
Gaza.
le
Finally,
Conseil
and
de
above all,
sécurité
the Security
aura
Council
à remettre
will
un
have
processus
to
politique sur les rails
get a political
visant
process
à
back on track,
l'établissement
a
de la
political
solution des
process
deux États,
aiming to
la
bring
seule
about
à
the
même de
two-state
garantir la
solution, the
paix.
only solution able to
Notre
guarantee
Conseil ne
peace.
pourra
Our
naturellement se
Council, of
substituer aux
course,
partis,
cannot
mais
replace
son
the
rôle sera
parties
central.
to the
La
parties, but
France
its role
prendra
will
ses
be a pivotal one.
responsabilités
France will
et
shoulder its
proposera dans les
responsibilities
jours qui
and will
viennent
propose
une
in the coming
initiative au
days
Conseil de
an
sécurité.
initiative within the
Je vous
Security
remercie.
Council. I thank you.
I thank the representative of France for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr.
La Suisse a
President.
voté en faveur de ce projet de résolution et salue son adoption par le Conseil de sécurité. C'est enfin un signe d'espoir. Car ce vote doit marquer un retour vers plus d'humanité dans le conflit au Proche-Orient. La dignité humaine et la décence doivent nous définir comme communes, restaurer les infrastructures médicales, soulager le personnel médical et lui permettre d'accomplir à lui aussi sa mission sans danger. La résolution formule aussi une demande claire pour la libération immédiate et inconditionnelle des otages qui, eux aussi, ainsi que leurs familles, doivent pouvoir se retrouver enfin sains et saufs. Leur capture lors des actes terroristes du 7 octobre que la Suisse a fermement condamné contrevient au droit international. Le résultat d'aujourd'hui est un appel clair lancé à toutes les parties de cesser les hostilités et de respecter pleinement enfin leurs obligations en vertu du droit international, notamment du droit international humanitaire et des droits humains. Pour une mise en œuvre efficace de la résolution que nous venons d'adopter, le cessez-le-feu immédiat devra sans attendre mener à un cessez-le-feu durable. De même, étant donné les conséquences humanitaires catastrophiques qu'aurait une opération de large envergure à Rafah sur la population civile et les opérations humanitaires, une telle opération doit être évitée. Monsieur le Président, le secrétaire général hier au passage de Rafah a dit « Il est temps de faire taire les armes ». L'espoir, c'est d'être capable capable de
is
voir la
being able
lumière
to see
malgré
the
les
light
ténèbres.
in spite of the
Avec
darkness.
l'adoption de la résolution
With the
aujourd'hui,
adoption of the
il est
resolution
maintenant grand
today,
temps de
it is now
reprendre
time
espoir
to
et de
regain hope
travailler
and to
ensemble,
work
sans
together
relâche, à une
relentlessly
perspective de paix
towards a
durable,
prospect of
une
lasting
solution à
peace,
deux
a
États où
two-state
Israéliens
solution
et
where
Palestiniens
Israelis
peuvent
and
vivre côte à côte
Palestinians
en
can live
paix,
side by
en
side in
sécurité et en
peace,
dignité.
security
Je
and
vous remercie.
dignity. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Switzerland for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of China.
谢谢主席
I
先生。
thank you, Mr. President.
主席先生，
Mr. President,
中方对刚才的决议草案投了
China
赞成票
voted。in favor of the draft resolution
我
that
们
has
感
just
谢
been put
阿
to
尔
the
及
vote.
利亚
We thank
莫桑比
Algeria,
克
Mozambique,
等非常任
and
理事
other
国所
elected
做出的
council
努力。
members for their efforts.
上周五，
Last Friday,
安理会就
the
美
Security
国提出
Council
的另一份
voted on the
关于
other
加
draft
沙局
resolution
势的
proposed
决议草
by
案
the
进行
United
表决。
States on the situation in
中方
Gaza.
同阿尔及利亚
China, together with
俄罗斯一
Algeria
道
and Russia,
投了反对票。
voted against it.
对比
A
两项草
comparison
案，
of the two
可以
drafts
看出
shows
区别所
the
在。
differences.
当前的
The current
草案
draft
态度鲜明
is， unequivocal
方向
and
明
correct
确，
in its direction,
要求立即停火。
demanding an immediate
前一
ceasefire,
份草案
while the
是
previous one
拐弯
has
抹角、
been evasive
含混其
and
辞。
ambiguous.
当前的草
The
案
current draft
要求无条件
demands
停火，
an unconditional
前一
ceasefire,
份草案
while the previous
是为
one
停火
has set
设置前提。
preconditions for ceasefire.
当前的草案
The current draft
反映了国际
reflects
社会
the general
普遍期待，
expectations of the international
得到
community
阿拉伯国
and
家
enjoys
集
the
体支持。
collective support of the Arab
前一份
states,
草案
while the
却遭
previous
到
one
阿拉
has
伯
been
国家的
jointly
共同反对。
rejected by the Arab states.
两份草案分歧点
The differences between
归
the
根
two
到底
drafts
不是别
boil
的，
down to
而是
nothing,
要不要
but whether
立即
there should
无
be
条件
an
停火，
immediate and
能不能
unconditional
允许
ceasefire,
对
and
加
whether
沙民
the
众的
collective
集体惩
punishment
罚
of the people
继
of
续下去。
Gaza should be allowed to
在这个
continue.
问题上，
On this issue,
中方
China,
同国际社会
like
大多数
most
成员
members
一样，
of the international
从一
community,
开始
has been
态度就
very
是非
clear
常
from the
明
very
确。
outset.
无论是
Whether
上周五投
we
反对票，
voted against it
还
last
是今
Friday
天投
or
赞成
in
票，
favor of it today,
都是基于
our
我
vote
们一以
was
贯
based
之的
on our
立场和
consistent
主张。
position and propositions.
美国在多次否决安理会行动之后，
After repeated
终
vetoes
于
of
决
the
定
Council
不
actions,
再阻
the
挠
United
安理
States
会要求
finally
立
decided
即
to
停火
stop
的努力。
obstructing the Council's demand for an immediate
尽管如
ceasefire.
此，
Despite all this,
美方仍然寻找
the
种种借口，
U.S. still
对中
tried
国
to
进行
find
指责。
all kinds of excuses and made accusations against
国
China.
际社会的眼睛是雪
The,
亮的，
the eyes of the international
美方的
community
指
are
责
open and
完全
discerning.
站不住脚。
The accusations of the U.S.
恰恰
are
相反，
untenable. On the
正是
contrary,
中国和有关国家
it's
坚
because
持
of
原则，
China and other
主
countries
持正义，
concerned,
才
because of our
迫使
upholding of
美国
principles
认识
and
到
justice, then
美
the U.S.
不能
we force the
也
U.S.
无
to
法
realize that
再继续
it
阻挠
cannot
安理会朝
continue
着正确
to
方向
obstruct the
迈
efforts
出
of the
关键步
Council
伐，
to move in the right
正义
direction and
终
take
将胜利。
the decisive step. And justice will prevail in
主
the
席先
end.
生，
Mr.
加沙
President,
冲突爆发近6个月，
nearly 6 months after the
32000
outbreak of the
多
Gaza
无辜平
conflict,
民被夺去
over
生命。
32,000
对于已
innocent
经逝
civilians
去的生命，
have lost their
安理会
lives.
今
For
天
the
的决
lives
议
that have
来得
already
太迟了，
perished, the Council
但
resolution
对于
today
上
comes
百
too
万
late. But
仍
for the
深陷
millions of
前
people
所
in
未有
Gaza
人道
who
灾难的
remain
加沙民众来
mired
说，
in an
这
unprecedented
项决议
humanitarian
如果
catastrophe,
能得到
this
全面
resolution, if
有效落
fully
实，
and effectively
还
implemented,
是可以带
could
来
still
期待已久
bring
的希望。
long-awaited hope.
安理会决议
Security Council
是有约束力
resolutions
的，
are binding.
我们要求
We
当事
call
方
on the
履
parties
行联合国
concerned
宪章
to
规定的
fulfill
义
their
务，
obligations under the United
根
Nations
据决
Charter
议要求
and to
采
take
取
due
应
action
有
as
行动。
required by the
我们
resolution.
期待有
We
重要
expect
影响的
the
国家
state
对
with
当事方
significant
发挥
influence
积
to
极
play
作
a
用，
positive role
包括
on the
采取
party
一切
concerned. including by using all necessary and effective means at their disposal to support the implementation of the resolution. To this end, all harm to civilians must cease immediately, and the offensive against Gaza must be prevented at once. A ceasefire during the months of Ramadan is only the first step that must serve as the basis leading to a lasting, sustainable ceasefire and the early return of the people of Gaza who were forced to flee their homes. At the same time, the blockade of Gaza and the man-made barriers to access of humanitarian supplies must be lifted immediately to ensure that humanitarian supplies enter Gaza in sufficient quantities expeditiously to reach people in need in a safe and timely manner. We appreciate SG Guterres and the humanitarian agencies for their efforts. Israel must fully cooperate to open the Rafah and other land crossings. UNRWA is indispensable and irreplaceable for the people of Gaza to receive international humanitarian assistance. We urge all parties to fully restore funding to UNRWA as soon as possible. We categorically reject Israel's recent vicious campaign of attacks against UNRWA and the United Nations system as a whole. We welcome the efforts of Egypt, Qatar, and the United States to promote the release of the hostages and expect the speedy release of all hostages and detainees and their early return home. Mr. President, the Security Council, based on the adopted resolution today, continue to follow closely the situation in Gaza and get ready for further actions when necessary and ensure the timely and full implementation of its resolutions. China will continue to make unremitting efforts together with all parties to bring an early end to the fighting in Gaza, alleviate the humanitarian catastrophe, and implement the two-state solution. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of China for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
Gracias, presidente.
Thank you,
El
Mr.
Ecuador
President.
condena los
Ecuador
ataques terroristas en
condemns the
Moscú
terrorist attacks
y
in
expresamos
Moscow.
nuestra
We
solidaridad a las
express our
familias de las víctimas y
solidarity
al pueblo
to the
ruso.
families and the victims
Señor presidente,
and to the Russian people, Mr.
el
President.
proyecto que hemos
The
considerado
resolution
nació
that
como
we
una
have
idea de los
considered
miembros
gives us
elegidos
an idea.
de preparar un texto
Gives us an idea
que
of
pueda
how the
ser
elected members
aceptable
can
para
prepare a
todos los
text that
miembros
can
del
be
Consejo
acceptable to all
y le
members
permita
of the Council.
pronunciarse
It allows the
oportunamente
Council to
frente
speak
a una
out in a
situación
timely
humanitaria
fashion
en
in the face
constante
of
deterioro.
a humanitarian situation which
Por esto,
continues to worsen.
el texto es corto
Consequently, the text
y
is
demanda
short and
un cese al fuego
demands
por el mes del
a
Ramadán que
ceasefire for the month
permita
of
aliviar
Ramadan,
la
which
situación de la
will bring
población civil
relief to the
al
civilian
tiempo que exige la
population.
liberación
At the
inmediata e
same time, it
incondicional de
demands the
todos los
immediate and
rehenes
unconditional
y
release of
deplora
all
la violencia
hostages
contra
and
civiles
deplores the
y
violence
todos
against
los actos de
civilians
terrorismo,
and all
incluyendo implícitamente
victims
los execrables actos
of
cometidos por
acts of
Hamas en
terrorism,
octubre
including
pasado.
the execrable acts committed
Asimismo,
by Hamas in
el texto toma
October.
notas
The
de los
text
denodados
also takes
esfuerzos que
notes
viene
of
realizando
the
Egipto,
efforts
Qatar y
that
Estados
Egypt,
Unidos
Qatar, and the
para
US
lograr
are
un
making
acuerdo entre
to
las partes en el
achieve an
conflicto
agreement
que
between the
esperamos
parties to the
sean
conflict.
exitosos.
We hope those efforts will bear
El Ecuador
fruit.
ha votado a favor de
Ecuador
este
voted
proyecto de
in favor
resolución
of this
y se
draft
alegra de que haya
resolution,
sido
and we are
adoptado.
delighted that it has been
Valoramos la
adopted.
flexibilidad
We
demostrada
value
en
the
esta ocasión por todos los miembros
flexibility shown on
ante
this
una
occasion by
situación
all
tan
members in
apremiante
the
como
face
la que
of
se
a
vive en Gaza.
situation as urgent as
Debemos
that in
ahora
Gaza.
todos
We must now
velar
all
por la
together
implementación completa,
ensure that this
efectiva
resolution is
e inmediata
completely,
de lo que hemos
effectively,
decidido.
and
Muchas
immediately
gracias.
implemented. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Ecuador for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Guyana.
Thank you, Mr. President. Guyana condemns the terrorist attack that occurred in Moscow last week and also extend our condolences to the government and people of Russia. Mr. President, colleagues, Guyana is pleased that this council has finally been able to adopt a resolution which demands an immediate ceasefire, albeit for the month of Ramadan, leading to a lasting and sustainable ceasefire. After more than 5 months of a war of utter terror and destruction, A ceasefire is the difference between life and death for the hundreds of thousands of Palestinians and others. This demand comes at a significant time as Palestinians are observing the holy month of Ramadan. Sadly, this year's Ramadan is different for Palestinians, fatally different. The observance began as people weep over the killing of their loved ones, while bombs and bullets continue to fall indiscriminately around them. 17,000 children began Ramadan as orphans owing to this war. 70,000 families began Ramadan without a home, all rubble. Another 290,000 homes severely damaged. Instead of being in their homes, the sacred place where they usually pray, break fast, and commune with family and friends during this holy month, 3/4 of the population of Gaza are internally displaced. Ramadan is also a time for families to join for nightly feasts and a time to share food and other blessings with the less fortunate. But for the people in Gaza, there is man-made starvation, and we are already seeing evidence of a man-made famine. All of this when there is food available, but deliberately withheld. Women and children are disproportionately impacted. They represent the majority of those killed. Children and pregnant and lactating women are at higher risk of mortality due to lack of adequate nutrition. At the same time, the anguish of the families of the hostages held in Gaza continues to mount with no clear prospect for the return of their loved ones. Palestinians experience the same anguish waiting for their relatives who are illegally detained in Israel to come home. Guyana emphasizes the demand for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages. We also demand the release of all Palestinians held in Israeli jails without trial. Mr. President, colleagues, the realities that the population of Gaza has been facing since 7th of October have worsened with each passing day as the occupying power continues its atrocities. Given these realities and the consensus by elected members of this council that we must act, Guyana unhesitatingly collaborated with fellow elected members to put forward this draft resolution for an immediate ceasefire, the unconditional release of hostages, and for expanding humanitarian assistance. In this regard, we thank the coordinator of the E10, His Excellency Ambassador Pedro Comissario, and the delegation of Mozambique for their leadership of this process. We also thank our E10 colleagues and our P5 colleagues for finally, collectively, doing right by the Palestinian people. It is long overdue, but it is still the right thing to have done to stop the indignities against the Palestinian people. But this is just the beginning. The task before us now is to secure full compliance with this resolution and its predecessors, including 2712 and 2720. In this regard, Guyana calls for full adherence to these resolutions. Finally, Mr. President, dear colleagues, the holy month of Ramadan will end in a mere 15 days. It is therefore essential that this council and those with influence on the parties immediately redouble efforts to bring about the lasting and sustainable ceasefire this resolution calls for, to secure the release of hostages and to massively scale up humanitarian assistance. This is absolutely necessary to save lives, begin the reconstruction of Gaza, and to create a free state of Palestine with which Israel peacefully coexists. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Guyana for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Mr. President, Sierra Leone also expresses deepest condolences to the government and people of the Russian Federation following the heinous terrorist attacks last week. Terrorism and acts of terrorism in all forms and manifestation are condemnable and unjustifiable. Mr. President, the consideration and adoption of Resolution 2728, co-penned by the elected 10 members of the Council, including Sierra Leone, was born out of the need to address the current plight of the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, especially during this holy month of Ramadan, a time traditionally filled with peace, love, and devotion, amongst families and communities. We recognize the Palestinian people's collective struggle, facing each day in hardship, loss, displacement, and hunger. With that in mind, the E10 initiated the resolution just adopted, built on the purposes and principles of the UN Charter, including the responsibility of the Security Council in the United Nations Collective Security Scheme. With a clear imperative to act as mandated, but also with the establishment of a moral and political imperative, the Security Council demands an immediate ceasefire for the month of Ramadan, respected by all parties, leading to a lasting, sustainable ceasefire. The fighting must stop. The killings must stop. The suffering and collective punishment must end. The parties to the conflict are under obligation to respect this demand of the Security Council. The parties are urged to fully implement this resolution 2728, as well as resolutions 2712 and 2720. States with influence are urged to apply the necessary pressure on the parties to implement these resolutions. We continue to support the diplomatic effort of Egypt, Qatar, and United States as complementary to the effort and clear demand of the Security Council. The resolution just adopted also demands the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages, as well as ensuring humanitarian access to address their medical and other humanitarian needs, recalling that the taking of hostages is prohibited under international law. Mr. President, the resolution just adopted further demands the parties to the conflict to comply with their obligations under international law in relation to all persons they detain. This is reinforced by the reiteration of the Council's demand for the parties to comply with their obligation under international law, including international humanitarian law and human rights law, to protect all civilians, deploy attacks against civilians and civilian objects, violence and hostilities against civilians, and all acts of terrorism. Recognize that half of the population in the Gaza Strip are facing acute food shortages with the imminent risk of famine. The emphasis on the urgent need to expand the flow of humanitarian assistance to and reinforce the protection of civilians in the entire Gaza Strip is most significant. This demand is further reinforced by the reiteration of the further demand for the lifting of all barriers to the provision of humanitarian assistance at scale. The focus on the humanitarian needs of the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip is aimed at restoring their human dignity. In a similar way, the resolution recognizes the dignity of the hostages and the detainees. Mr. President, Sierra Leone abstained on the vote on the oral amendment proposed by the Russian Federation, even though noting the explanation by the Russian Federation, but compelled to ensure that the objective of demanding an immediate ceasefire is met. The conflict impacts both Israel and Palestinian civilians. Therefore, the demand for an immediate ceasefire for the month of Ramadan must lead to a lasting, sustainable ceasefire. It must lead to a permanent cessation of hostilities, and for Israel and Palestine to live side by side in peace, security, and stability. The ceasefire must lead towards the path of a two-state solution. We will continue in our resolve and support for the two-state solution, the only viable pathway to end the occupation and resolve this prolonged conflict. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
President, I'd like to start by offering the UK's sincere condolences for the terrorist attack at the Crocus City Hall near Moscow. Our deepest sympathy goes to the families of the many victims. President, the United Kingdom has long been calling for an immediate humanitarian pause leading to a sustainable ceasefire without a return to destruction, fighting, and loss of life as the fastest way to get hostages out and aid in. That is what this resolution calls for and why the United Kingdom voted yes on this text. President, Israel continues to reckon with the brutal horror of the October 7 attacks, and innocent hostages continued to be held by Hamas in Gaza. Israel has a right to defend itself and ensure such an attack can never happen again. We regret that this resolution has not condemned the terrorist attacks perpetrated by Hamas on the 7th of October. The UK condemns these attacks unequivocally. This resolution sets out the urgent demand for the unconditional release of all hostages, and we welcome the ongoing diplomatic efforts by Egypt, Qatar, and the United States to this end. The intense suffering of innocent Palestinian civilians in Gaza shows no sign of abating, and a humanitarian catastrophe is unfolding before our eyes. The resolution sends a clear and united message on the need for international humanitarian law to be upheld and for aid to be scaled up urgently, including the lifting of all barriers impeding its delivery. President, the UK Foreign Secretary and Prime Minister have reiterated these messages in our contact with Prime Minister Netanyahu and other senior Israeli political leaders in recent weeks. We call for this resolution to be implemented immediately. President, we need to focus on how we chart the way from an immediate humanitarian pause to a lasting, sustainable peace without a return to fighting. That means the formation of a new Palestinian government for the West Bank and Gaza, accompanied by an international support package. Removing Hamas' capacity to launch attacks against Israel. Hamas no longer being in charge of Gaza. And a political horizon which provides a credible and irreversible pathway towards a two-state solution of Israel and Palestine living side by side in security and peace. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Russian Federation.
Господин председатель,
Mr. President,
уважаемые коллеги,
distinguished colleagues,
Россия проголосовала
Russia
за
voted in favor of the draft resolution
подготовленный десятками
prepared by
постоянных членов
the
Совета
10
Безопасности.
non-permanent members of the Security Council.
Принципиально важно, что
It is of
СБ
fundamental
ООН
importance that the
впервые
UN Security
требует
Council
от
for the first
сторон
time is demanding the
соблюдения
parties
немедленного
the
прекращения
observance of an
огня,
immediate
пусть и
ceasefire,
ограниченного в месяц.
even if it is limited to the month of Ramadan.
К сожалению, то, что
Unfortunately,
случится после его
what
окончания,
happens after that ends
пока остается неясным,
remains unclear,
поскольку формулировка lasting
since the word lasting
может интерпретироваться
could
по-разному.
be interpreted in various different ways.
И это весьма показательно.
And that is very telling.
То есть те, кто покрывает Израиль,
Those who
хотят
are providing
по-прежнему
cover for
оставить ему
Israel still
свободу.
want to give it a free hand.
Очень хочется верить, что
We very
эта
much want to
формулировка
believe
будет
that this
использована в
wording will be
интересах мира,
used in the interests
а
of
не
peace
продвижения
rather than
бесчеловечной операции
advancing the
Израиля против
inhumane Israeli
палестинцев.
operation against the Palestinians.
Формулировка permanent
The word
была бы более
permanent
точной.
would be more
И
precise,
мы разочарованы,
and
что
we are
она
disappointed
не прошла.
that it did not make it through.
Но все равно
But
считаем для себя
nevertheless,
принципиально
we
важным
believe it is
проголосовать за него.
fundamentally important to vote in favor of peace.
Тем не менее, Совет
Nevertheless,
должен
the
продолжить
Council must
работать
continue to
над
work
достижением
on
постоянного
achieving
прекращения
a
огня.
permanent ceasefire.
Отмечаем и содержащиеся в
We also
резолюции
note
требования
what is contained in the
немедленного
resolution, the
и
demand
безусловного
for an
освобождения заложников.
immediate and unconditional release of the hostages.
22 марта в истории
On the
Совета
22nd of
Безопасности
March,
была очередная
there was
крайне печальная
another very
страница,
tragic day in the history of the
когда
Security
его
Council,
интригами и
when through
шантажом пытались
intrigues and
толкнуть по ложному
blackmail,
пути и вынудить
They
принять
tried to
документ,
put
который
us
не
on the
только не
wrong path
содержал
and to
прямого
coerce us to
требования
adopt a
или хотя
document
бы
that not
призыва
only
к
didn't contain
прекращению,
a demand or at least a call for a
но
ceasefire,
и фактически
but
выдавал, как в
essentially was
тот день
presented
выразился постоянный
as
представитель
the
Алжира,
permanent representative of Algeria said
лицензию
on
на
that day, as
дальнейшее
a license
убийство
for the
палестинцев.
further killing of Palestinians.
Этого ни мы, ни наши алжирские и
Neither
китайские
we
коллеги
nor our
допустить не
Algerian
могли.
and Chinese colleagues could allow that.
С первого дня эскалации в
From
зоне
the first day of the
Палестино-израильского
escalation in the
конфликта
Palestinian-Israeli
российская
conflict zone,
делегация
the Russian delegation
призывала членов
has been
Совета
calling upon
Безопасности
members of the
ООН
Security Council
отреагировать на
to respond to
беспрецедентную
the
вспышку насилия
unprecedented upsurge in
четким и
violence with
недвусмысленным
precise
требованием
and
о
an
немедленном
unambiguous
постоянном
demand for an
прекращении огня
immediate
в секторе
permanent
Газа,
ceasefire in the Gaza Strip,
выполнив свой мандат по поддержанию международного
and so
мира и
doing fulfilling its
безопасности.
mandate for the maintenance of international peace and
Сегодня в
security.
ходе голосования по
Today,
нашей
during the
поправке
vote
мы
on
еще
our
раз увидели
amendment, we
истинное
once
лицо
again saw
наших
the
коллег
true face
ПСД
of
и
our colleagues on
убедились
the
в том,
Security Council,
кто
and we
действительно хочет
realized who
прекращения,
truly wants
а не приостановки
to end
бесчеловечной
rather
израильской
than
операции.
suspend the inhumane Israeli operation.
Хотели бы обратить внимание
We
на
would like
следующее.
to point out the following.
То, что сегодня произошло, это
What took place
ответ тем,
today
кто
is a
критикует
response to
право
those
вето
who
у постоянных
criticize
членов
the
Совета
veto power
Безопасности.
of the permanent members of the Security
Ведь не
Council.
примени его 22
Because
марта
if we hadn't
Россия и
used
Китай,
it, if Russia and China hadn't used
вместо
it on the
короткого
22nd of
текста,
March, instead of a
способного
short
остановить
text
насилие в
that
секторе
could
Газа,
end the violence in the
мы
Gaza
могли
Strip,
бы иметь
we
весьма
could have
вредный
ended
текст
up with a very
американской
harmful
резолюции,
text in
который
the US
не то что
resolution
не требовал
that not
прекращения
only
огня,
didn't demand a
но и
ceasefire,
фактически
but
давал
also
Израилю
essentially would
лицензию
have given
на
Israel
продолжение
a
своих
license to
действий против
continue its
палестинцев,
actions against the
в том числе
Palestinians,
в Рафахе.
including in Rafah.
Хотел бы в завершении напомнить
In conclusion, I
представителям
would like to
Соединенных
remind the
Штатов,
representative of the United
которые раз за
States,
разом
who time and
обвиняют Совет
again
в
accuses the
неспособности осудить
Council of
атаку
not
на
being able
Израиль,
to condemn attacks on
а Россию в
Israel
неспособности
and
осудить
Russia of not being able
террористическую
to
атаку
condemn
7 октября.
the 7th of October terrorist attack.
18
On
октября
the
у
18th of
делегации Соединенных
October, the
Штатов была
US
возможность
delegation
принять
had an
бразильский
opportunity
проект
to adopt the
резолюции
Brazilian
с
draft
однозначным
resolution with
осуждением
a clear
событий 7
condemnation
октября
of
и
the 7th of
гуманитарную
October
паузу.
and with a humanitarian
Причем
pause.
в тех формулировках,
And
на
yet, in
которых
that
настаивал
wording
Вашингтон.
that we presented to Washington, that was insisted upon by Washington.
Напомню, что
I
тогда
remind you that
делегация
at that
России
time, the delegation of
при
Russia,
голосовании по резолюции
when voting
воздержалась,
on the
а
resolution,
заветировали
abstained,
бразильский текст
but
именно
the
Соединенные
United
Штаты.
States vetoed the
Поэтому
Brazilian text.
винить вы
Therefore,
должны лишь себя.
you should only accuse yourselves.
Нельзя возвращаться к этому моменту
We must not
бесконечно, так как за
return to this
прошедшие с
moment
7 октября
endlessly
полгода
since the 6
на
months that have
действия
taken place
ХАМАС,
since the 7th
которые
of October,
неоднократно
the Hamas
осудили все
actions that have
члены
repeatedly
Совета
been condemned
Безопасности в
by all
национальном
members of the
качестве,
Security Council in their national
Израиль
capacity.
ответил
Israel
бесчеловечными
responded with
преступлениями
an
и коллективным
inhumane
наказанием
crimes and the
палестинского
collective
народа,
punishment of the
в
Palestinian
результате
people,
чего
as a
погибли
result
более
of which
32
more than
тысяч ни в чем не повинных
32,000
граждан,
entirely innocent citizens have
большинство
died,
из которых
the
женщины и
majority of
дети.
whom are women and
Только
children.
вдумайтесь в эти цифры.
Just think about those numbers.
Хочу напомнить и о том,
I would
что
also
Россия
like to remind
сразу
you
и
that
недвусмысленно
immediately and
осудила
unambiguously,
произошедшее
Russia
7
condemned what took
октября,
place on the
и
7th of
незачем
October,
продолжать спекулировать
and
на
there's
эту
no
тему.
need to continue speculating on that
Мы не
subject.
понаслышке знаем, что
You
такое
know
международный
we know
терроризм.
firsthand what
К
international
сожалению, мы
terrorism is.
столкнулись с
Unfortunately,
чудовищным по
we
его
faced a
проявлением,
monstrous manifestation of it,
проявлением звериного лица
its brutal
терроризма снова.
face of terrorism once again.
Совершенный 22 марта
The
на территории нашей
22nd
страны
of March
террористический
terrorist
акт
attack committed on the territory of our country
унес десятки, по крайней мере, 143 ни в чем
at
не
least
повинных жизней, по крайней мере,
143 entirely innocent lives,
143 ни в чем не повинных
the
граждан,
very least of 143 entirely
которые были
innocent
хладнокровно
civilians
расстреляны.
who were shot in
И мы
cold blood.
сталкивались с
And
такими
we
проявлениями
have
терроризма
faced
еще
such
в 90-е
manifestations of
годы
terrorism also
и
in the
понесли
90s,
тяжелые утраты.
and we suffered heavy losses as a result.
Признательны всем тем, кто
We are
высказал
grateful to
нам
all of
сегодня
those who
свои
today
соболезнования.
expressed their condolences.
Благодарю вас.
Thank you.
I thank the representative of Russian Federation for their statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as a representative of Japan. The humanitarian situation in Gaza is catastrophic, even during the holy month of Ramadan, with high levels of food insecurity, poverty, imminence of famine, and nearly 1.5 million people sheltering in Rafah, struggling each day for their survival. We deeply mourn the tens of thousands of lives lost in the conflict, starting from October 7th terrorist attack and thereafter on the ground. In this vein, It is absolutely essential for the Security Council to demand an immediate ceasefire for the month of Ramadan, respected by all parties, leading to lasting, sustainable ceasefire in Gaza. We, all Council members, also need to demand the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages, as well as ensuring humanitarian access to address their medical and other humanitarian needs. This is why Japan, as one of the co-pen holders, has tabled the draft resolution. We welcome the Council was able to pass a resolution proposed by the E10 today. In addition, we strongly support the ongoing diplomatic efforts, in particular the four-party talks towards a ceasefire in connection with the release of all remaining hostages. We believe that ceasefire could pave the path towards sustainable peace and stability in the region, which is what the international community voices to us every day. Japan will continue to work at the Council to achieve that path. I thank you. I resume function as the President of the Council. I now give the floor to the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine.
Mr. President, I wish to begin my statement by conveying deepest condolences to the government, people, and my good friend Vasily. Our condolences of the Russian Federation following the horrific terrorist attack in Moscow. We express our sympathy to the bereaved families and stand in solidarity with our Russian brothers and sisters in these difficult days. Mr. President, it has taken 6 months, over 100,000 Palestinians killed and maimed, 2 million displaced, and famine for this council to finally demand an immediate ceasefire. A vote for humanity to prevail, for life to prevail. The Palestinians in Gaza pleaded and appealed, shouted, cried, cursed, prayed, defied the odds to survive time and time again, and yet continue to face death, destruction and displacement, deprivation and disease, and an occupation-made famine. They are bombed, besieged, buried under the rubble of the houses they had built. They are killed in their homes, in the streets, in hospitals, in ambulances, in UN shelters, and even in tents. Their ordeal must come to an end and must come to an immediate end now. As we speak, families prepare to break their fast, missing loved ones around the table, and they will find nothing to put on their children's plate. In fact, there is no home sheltering them. There is no table to gather around, and no plates to fill and no food to eat. They lost their homes. They lost loved ones, some of them still trapped under the rubble. Imagine being a parent with kids under the rubble and others alive, feeling broken, but forced to go on for those who remained. Yesterday, Palestinian Christians celebrated Palm Sunday in besieged and destroyed churches that have become shelters in Gaza. They gathered, surrounded by death and praying for resurrection. Palestinian families cannot mourn or heal. They have to find a way to survive and help what is left of their family survive. Mr. President, when such atrocities are being committed in broad daylight against defenseless civilians, including women and children, the right thing to do, the only thing to do morally, legally, politically, is to put an end to it. There can be no justification for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. Accepting any justification for such crimes is renouncing our humanity and destroying the rule of international law beyond repair. Mr. President, 2 months ago, the highest international court, the ICJ, determined there was a real and imminent risk of irreparable prejudice to the plausible rights of Palestinians under the Genocide Convention. It ordered Israel to undertake immediate measures in relation to its mass and indiscriminate killing of Palestinians, to depriving Palestinians of the essential goods for their survival, to the incitement to genocide. Instead of implementing this mandatory order by the court, Israel has doubled down in the commission of its crimes. Your leaders have said in no uncertain terms that Israel is responsible for the famine underway in Gaza and has used starvation as a method of war. They have called on Israel not to use humanitarian aid as a bargaining chip. They spoke of a man-made disaster, meaning an Israeli occupation-made disaster. They have called repeatedly on Israel to stop its indiscriminate bombing and to spare civilian life to no avail. They have called repeatedly on Israel to give civilians safe haven. Instead, it attacked them even in hospital and UN shelters. It attacked them in the very places it asked them to heed to. It killed them if they stayed and killed them if they left. And now it continues to threaten a ground operation in Rafah, where it has pushed them and confined them at the very edge of the Gaza Strip in yet another attempt to forcibly displace our people. Instead of heeding these calls, Israel has attacked those making them. It continues, in particular, its incitement against the UN, its Secretary General, whom we salute him from this place, its agencies, notably UNRWA, the lifeline for Palestinians in Gaza. The Israeli Foreign Minister wrote that UNRWA cooperates with terrorists and that the UN has become, under the leadership of Antonio Guterres, and I quote, an anti-Semitic and anti-Israeli body that shelters and emboldens terror. Defend the Secretary General and the UN. This outrageous incitement has real-life consequences for UN and humanitarian staff on the ground who are targets of attacks, who are killed, arrested, and tortured, who are humiliated and harassed. It has also real-life consequences for Palestinians, as Israel has used it as a pretext to block humanitarian aid to be distributed by UNRWA. It is time for all these Israeli actions to trigger a serious international reaction, one that enforces consequences for these crimes rather than just make pleas that Israel continues to dismiss. There is no humanity when our lives are treated as expendable. There are no rules without enforcement. And Israel has been treated as a state above the law for so long that it feels it no longer has to hide when acting as an outlaw state. From ethnic cleansing to genocide. Our agony is caused by Israelis' actions, but also by the impunity it has been afforded, by the fact countries have not taken decisive measures to stop it, and many continue to call it and treat it as an ally even while it is committing such atrocities. Mr. President, we express our appreciation to the E10, all of you, for having put forward this resolution, and we welcome its adoption by the Council. We thank Algeria for representing us and all the Arab countries in this endeavor. We salute Arab unity in demanding immediate ceasefire and prevailed. This must be a turning point. This must lead to saving lives on the ground. This must signal the end of this assault of atrocities against our people. A nation is being murdered. A nation is being dispossessed. A nation is being displaced for decades now, but never at this scale since the Nakba. Never this openly, from Tantura to Gaza, from 1948 to 2024, we have endured. We have survived. We have resurrected only to face death once again. Life must prevail in Gaza. Must prevail in Gaza. Freedom must prevail in Palestine. For 6 months now, every single Palestinian in Gaza has endured untold suffering, loss, pain, and tragedy. This must stop now. Palestinian hostages, Palestinian victims are not less deserving of compassion and empathy, of outrage and solidarity. They must be freed from fear and want, from siege and occupation, from death and dispossession. Families must be reunited and start to heal, at least from the wounds that can actually be healed. They must be given the chance to bury their loved ones, to mourn their loss, to rebuild what can be. Even if the ceasefire happened now and the siege was lifted now, it would take generations to deal with the trauma and the devastation. Mr. President, now that this council has finally called for a ceasefire, all forces should coalesce to make sure it is enforced. Apologies to those who the world has failed, to those that could have been saved and were not. Save the lives of those who survived against all odds. Tell them help is on the way. Hold accountable those who inflicted such suffering upon them. End this injustice. End it now. All of this is long overdue. And I thank you very much, Mr. President.
I thank the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Israel.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, at the outset, I want to express my deepest